In the video game industry, you often hear games being described as more or less than the sum of their parts. Some details might have some potentially fatal flaws in them, but it might all come together in a cohesive package so well that those flaws fade a bit into the background. On the other hand, maybe those small yet tasty details are right on the money, but something just doesn't come together quite right. I mention this because Metroid Prime 4 Beyond somehow shoots right in between these two common sentiments to create maybe the first time a game is exactly the sum of its parts. And let me tell you, that equation is quite messy. To be clear, this doesn't make it a bad game, it just makes it a bit more difficult to sort through the criticisms that I and others may have. Prime 4's sum is derived from a complexity that is probably a bit closer to quantum mechanics than a simple 2 plus 2 equals 4, especially because of criticisms from the most vocal of people. It feels like there are certain ones that, to me, represent a complete misunderstanding of what makes Metroid Prime great, or even what makes a Metroid Prime game a Metroid Prime game. It honestly seems that in the Prime series' absence, people have forgotten not what Metroid is about, but what Metroid Prime is about. I mean, if you consider the circumstances, that last part makes sense, doesn't it? Tons of new fans and hype spreading like a virus from waiting for over a decade made it feel like a massive bomb dropped when Prime 4 turned out to be one of the weakest games in the franchise. Suddenly, it's an 80 on Metacritic, mixed reviews from different outlets, Reddit threads are full of conflicting comments, and YouTubers aren't recommending it. It seems like Nintendo had another disappointment hit the Switch too. But now that the dust has settled a little bit, let's slow down and look past all this expectation and disappointment. Let's strip the game down to reveal the hard truth. Most people are wrong about this game in at least one way, because we'll go over some harsh criticisms of the controversial decisions that it made, and some claims about this game and the series as a whole that go a bit overboard, especially ones that touch on Prime's current relevance in the Metroidvania genre. So, where do we even start? Well, I want to try to explain what I think Metroid is about because I think it's going to be important for recontextualizing Prime 4's strengths and weaknesses. Metroid, to me, above all else, is about finding new routes forward in a maze that is fundamentally against you. This series has evolved to the point where the entire map is one giant puzzle that stacks the deck in its favor, with all these twisting hallways and a bunch of locked doors around the map, asking if you have the power-up as the key. These are usually laid in a way that invites you to bash your head against a wall until you bash your head against the right one, and it opens up a secret path which in turn allows you to go even further. Enemies are there to spice up the rooms and create new challenges for you to overcome, so the maze isn't purely about exploration, it's also about survival. The upgrades you get help you get further in the maze, whether that's allowing you to make more mistakes or allowing you to use more powerful attacks. Maybe it's allowing you to access a completely new area to progress forward. Ultimately, the short summary I want you to remember is this. Metroid's about the experience of solving and surviving a maze and being rewarded in small ways for it. Prime is a different beast entirely from the regular Metroid series. First of all, combat is de-emphasized, and exploration, platforming, puzzle solving, and visual storytelling is way more important. There's only one single mechanic you need to examine in order to know this. Metroid Prime has a lock-on, as an FPS. Let that sink in. Aiming skills are now worthless, unlike other FPS games that at least require some sort of mastery on this. Even if it's a slower FPS campaign, like BioShock, you still have to learn how to aim and shoot at enemies that rush towards you. In contrast, enemies in the Prime series are more geared towards either puzzle solving or shooting your bullets at the right time or dodging at the right time instead of cover mechanics or stealth sections. Now, why does any of this matter? Because many will say that Metroid Prime 4 is extremely outdated and disappointing. They say that the open world light aspects are bad because they're empty and uninspired, that there is a severe lack of anything original in this game. Most of the power-ups you get are complete reskins of every single power-up you have gotten before, and what little that is added isn't super compelling, that the game is linear and boring and doesn't do much to establish itself as a modern Metroid game in 2025. Are they right? Yeah, kind of, in some ways. Imagine you walk into a giant mansion and, much to your surprise, most of the mansion is just one giant, nearly empty room. I'm not talking about a big entryway or lobby, I'm talking about legitimately One room that is the size of at least 20 rooms combined with nothing but a dozen chairs littered 15 or 20 feet apart. There are no twisting hallways, meaning that in order to get from one room that contains the bathroom to a bedroom or an office, you have to travel across this massive, towering, furniture-infested room every single time. Going the fastest you possibly can, it takes 2 minutes to cross the room in a dead sprint. What does this encourage you to do? Travel between rooms when you have to take a break from building a flush and Balatro on your PlayStation, or stay in the bathroom and just pull out Balatro on the toilet and flush there? Looks to me like you're going to be sitting on that toilet for hours, because this dumb mansion analogy is Prime 4's map design and its problems in a nutshell. The game weirdly has this gigantic wasteland that separates each of the 6 areas in the game. The intro area and the final boss are in the middle of the map, while each area that contains a teleporter key that you need to grab is in the corners, with an additional area just chilling on the left-hand side of the map. The negative space in between all these areas is both bigger and smaller than you would expect. In comparison to the monumental and lifelike world in The Witcher 3 or Tears of the Kingdom, it doesn't take that long to get from one end to the other, but it's fairly empty, so it feels way bigger than it actually is. When you first start playing the game, it doesn't seem like a huge problem, since it's easy to view this desert as a simple thoroughfare, like Hyrule Field. Go from A to B as fast as you can, and nothing is wrong, right? It's just a bit of a boring area, wasted space for you to traverse, but ultimately ignore. Well, most other Metroid games' areas have a unique way of looping back in on itself, and that's a huge appeal in a Metroid game for me. Now when you get a power-up in one region, you need to use it in another, which only happens like 2 or 3 times. You have to drive all the way across the map to another region instead of just traversing by foot. This seems like it should take the same amount of time as if you were to backtrack across the world in Prime 1. Heck, it might even take less time, but you're not really interacting with the game in the same way, are you? In Prime 1, you have to double back a little, and while it was tedious at times, I was never really bored. It's because the game is designed around interacting with rooms multiple times. You're going to go from A to B with a new power-up, making it easier to traverse A to B, or maybe there's a new smaller missile expansion that makes the trip worthwhile, or maybe you're passing by a new area you can now access and want to follow a rabbit hole that you haven't been down yet while not caring if you hit a dead end that forces you to turn around. What this ultimately amounts to is that in Prime 4 there's a sense of discovery that's missing. The game struggles to evoke the feeling of worthwhile exploration, and that's an integral part of why Prime 1 was so special. This is one of the biggest issues in Prime 4 for me, and probably the most integral flaw in the game. I know that there are a lot of people who complain about the desert because it's empty except for the green crystals you can and are forced to collect, but that's small potatoes compared to the desert existing in the first place. We'll talk about the crystals a bit later with the chatty NPCs, which are the 2 most popular complaints of the game, but even if the desert was full of random, worthwhile activities to do, I would still hate it, because of how it fundamentally changes the game to be a lot less about exploration than it should be. This is seen by the game seemingly being afraid for you to get lost, when getting lost in Prime 1 is kind of the point. Prime 1 is laid out in a way that feels like areas overlap. You jump from one area to the next, only to have to backtrack to an earlier area. And right when you think an area is finished, you'll find some door you forgot about, and you enter it for it to take you on a 15-minute path to an elevator that plops you down in the middle of nowhere in some other area. And I loved every second of this, because the game was about finding these new ways forward, and then getting a cool new power-up, and then feeling in awe when you stumble upon a new area. Prime 4 is the opposite of this. Every time that you do not know where to go, even for a split second, you get a quick chime-in from a Federation officer that you meet in the story named Miles. Why don't you check out the areas that you've already been? Have you tried visiting the Volt Forge? Take a trip back to the Ice Belt. This man does not stop yapping. It confused me why the game even did this. If the Metroid Prime series was about figuring out where to go next, why spoil it when I can finally figure it out for myself? Well, the more I thought about it, I was actually grateful for mumbling Miles in his merry mouth, because if Miles didn't do what he did, then I think I would have a worse experience. I've never seen this before. I think a Metroidvania game realizes that not telling you where to go in almost every instance would just waste your time and be exponentially more frustrating, so it just undercuts its own design. Partly because heading in the wrong direction is so costly, but mostly due to the nature of the game. I mean, there isn't even an explorer's intuition that you can follow. In many games with freehand exploration, there's this feeling of, I came here, now I go there, let me check the map, based on direction or details of the world, like passing a landmark and heading in a new direction from it, but I know not to return in this direction for a bit. Or, I just took this elevator and have a few branching paths, and this one didn't lead anywhere, so let's try the next one. Add this in with a 2-minute requirement for driving in a straight line to go from one area to the next, and you get a map that's a complete and utter disaster. If the game forced you to go between areas more often, it would be easy to choose wrong, and when you do choose wrong, guess what? Time to hit the sands again. For 2 minutes. So the game just shoves ways to bypass trying to figure out where to go next. Just imagine how many times you had to backtrack in Prime 1, and now transfer that over to Prime 4's current map. It might have been so bad that the game would need a complete redesign, and maybe even a restart in its development cycle. Wait a minute. During the very early hours in my playthrough of Prime 4, a hope sprung up in my mind that if the game is broken into smaller areas, then maybe those smaller areas are compelling. Maybe there are intricately designed rooms within those areas that allow for exploration to be rewarded, and a shadow of Prime 1 can be felt 5 times on a smaller scale. Sadly, these hopes got shot with a charged plasma beam with how fast they evaporated, because that's not the case at all. Prime 4 moves through levels in a very structured and intentional way. There's some Metroidvania-like barriers to entering some of the regions, but once those are down, they all flow a similar way. Move through most of the area, finish the area's objective, get a new power-up, and come back when you need to finish the other 5% that contains what you need. I find it more similar to a regular campaign in an FPS, especially with how on rails the story can get and take over during the different areas. On your first visit to each area, it is very rare for the game to require you to revisit a room. For example, take the Volt Forge. It seems like it breaks this rule because you have to work your way to the bottom of each tower, turn it on, and then take the same route back up, just with all the machinery alive and working, which provides some new challenges. But once you're done with each tower, you're not going to interact with the rooms again for a really long time. You come back here eventually for the electric shot upgrade, but these little detours always come after you have finished 95% of the area. It boggles my mind that more notes weren't taken from Prime 1, even if it wasn't perfect. That game is at its weakest when you are fighting a lot of enemies at once in quick succession, and backtracking through areas too often without any new rooms or power-ups. That's why I dread the trip to Glacier 1 and collecting the Chozo artifacts every playthrough. The former throws enemies at you non-stop in quick succession, while the latter forces you to trek back all over the map in the longest victory lap in any game ever. In my opinion, both of these are pacing issues though, not necessarily design ones. Prime 4 feels like it kind of relishes in these flaws at times, making it feel like it specializes in some of the worst moments from Prime 1. Much like Glacier 1, most of this game's campaign relies on a pacing that has you fighting lots of enemies in between rooms. Why that's bad is that no matter how enjoyable these rooms are, they often get saddled with repetitive but cinematic enemy encounters. I don't like this at all, not only because these encounter-heavy sections represent the worst of the Prime series, but because the enemy variety in this game only makes the issue stand out more. For the love of the Lemorne, can somebody please tell me what is compelling about any of these regular enemies? It feels like Prime 4 throws the same 3 enemies at you, and it drives me bonkers. Outside of the bosses, there's the robots and their slight variations, the spinny things and their slight variations, and the grievers and their slight variations. There are some random creatures you fight, but the bulk of the enemies are these 3 types. This issue is exacerbated by the fact that most enemies can be shot to death with any type of ammo. Some ammo types make killing the enemies easier, but actually using your brain to take down an enemy happens about once an area. They mix things up a little bit with a grapple ability later in the game, but when you get used to that, good luck, soldier. You better like mashing the trigger against the same enemies over and over again. And now the biting criticism that everyone is waiting for. Let's briefly talk about the issues that everyone seems to care about the most. That's the Green Crystal Hunt and the Federation soldiers. For those that haven't played, the game makes you gather a significant number of green crystals that are just randomly placed around the big desert with no amount of critical thinking to gather them. The only purpose they serve is to get a suit that is required to beat the game, and that's it. It makes this a pointless fetch quest that's mandatory. The other major complaint is a half-dozen chatty characters in a game series where Samus is a silent protagonist and not many other characters talk, which makes for dialogue being a bit awkward. You'll get this quippy dialogue and Samus is just standing there going, One-sided dialogue isn't inherently bad, but it does make the bad lines stand out more because more weight is put on what one character is saying at one time. There are two big thoughts that come to mind when discussing both of these subjects. One, it is undeniably true that both these things bring down the quality of the game. They are mostly as bad as everyone says they are. The green crystals are a waste of time to recover, and I would rather do the Chozo artifact hunt 3 times in a row. All it's here for is to pad the length of the game. The NPCs are just as bad, even if they do get slightly less annoying the more you get used to them. That's still really bad though. It's like saying that you can't smell the shit you are waiting in anymore because you've been standing in it for hours. With lines like this,
"It's about to get real nerdy in here."
And this,
Sarge, look! She's doing morph ball.
Yes.
I wish my suit could do that.
you start to feel like you're playing a parody of Metroid and not the actual thing. But second, and more importantly, I can't believe that these are the two biggest talking points about Prime 4's quality and what's ruining it for everyone. Look, these things are significant and are definitely worth complaining about. Believe me, I was cursing Sol Valley's ancestors for the crystals even existing, and Armstrong is now a swear word to me. But they're icing on the cake. Icing is not the most important part of the cake, but it's the part that you see the most when you're looking at the cake from a glance, especially when you don't cut into it. These problems feel like a consequence of the poor design decisions that came before, not the actual cause of all the problems with this game. Like, at least the Chozo keys were hidden around the map and you had to do some puzzles in order to get them, even if it is as simple as using a double jump or a boost ball in the right area. But the green crystals are just scattered to the wind in the desert. I know that every Prime game has a dumb endgame quest. It's kind of a staple at this point, but it's still bad, and it only feels like it's here to fill empty space with something to do, like they decided that they had to make this large desert work first and foremost. Similarly, the NPC dialogue feels like it exists because they didn't know what story they wanted to tell. There's a story about the Lemorn and how they became extinct, and then there's also small stories about the Federation soldiers, like Armstrong becoming less of a rookie, or giving Tokabi random cutscenes about his past. Is this a story about how the Lemorn's remaining hopes got crushed by their own ambition? Or is this a story about Federation soldiers learning to grow and ultimately coming together as a group? It's both, I guess. Either way, it's a weaker story that's inconsistent not just in quality, but in focus. Overall, Prime 4 is a massive disappointment, especially compared to the previous games in the series. The level design pales in comparison to Prime 1. The world is open and empty, and is probably the worst designed Metroid game in a long time, which is saying something because we don't get many. Nothing connects in a satisfying way, and it feels like the point of going on an atmospheric journey, like in Prime 1, was lost. Many parts of the campaign feel like a bunch of enemy encounters with the same enemies, which was the worst part of Prime 1, and finally, the green crystals are an abomination to Metroid, and the NPCs are in almost every way as bad as people say they are. And that's all that needs to be said about Prime 4. An open and shut case of another flop from Nintendo. Make the title of this video, Prime 4 is terrible in all caps. Maybe even AI generate Samus frowning for the thumbnail and put disappointing somewhere in bold text on it. Haven't done that before, just to get those sweet, sweet Nintendo hater clicks. I can smell the YouTube money already. Well, I hate to break it to you, but we're not done here. What if I told you that I've been hiding something from you guys? Not completely, because I stand by all my criticisms of the world design, the green crystals, the NPCs, the enemies, and everything that I just mentioned, but there's something really important that I haven't told you all. Something that might change your perception on this game in this video, and hopefully might cause you to think twice about this game's discourse. I'm about to challenge some very specific criticisms that I have seen of this game. And why is that? Because overall, I enjoyed my time with Prime 4. I liked the game. And here's where the video flips on its head. But first, to clarify, Prime 4 is not the best game released this year. It is actually so far from it. It pales in comparison to the likes of Clair Obscur, Death Stranding 2, and Donkey Kong, but I still had a good time. Now, much like a true Metroid game, it's time to backtrack through all of my complaints to find some of the positives, especially because there's a couple of common gripes about Prime 4 that I haven't talked about yet, and they aren't really viable, and I want to dissect them all to put this game in its place and give it a few compliments along the way as well. Namely, there are complaints that Prime 4 is too linear for a Metroid game, its optional power-ups and items aren't creative enough with their challenges, and it doesn't do enough to innovate. I don't think any of these are purely true, they just have elements of truth in them, and they're being constructed into arguments against the game that I can't get behind. Ultimately, every false negative criticism that I have heard are positive qualities of Prime 4 that are marred by the other negative parts of the experience that we have already talked about, which is the poor map layout and level design. Despite some of my preferences, it's not too linear to be considered a Metroid game. Its power-ups and optional items are 100% fine, even good, hell, great, and the Prime franchise isn't inherently outdated. First and foremost, there is a base level of fun that I had with this game that I thought it was important to mention. It's a traditional FPS campaign with a Metroid power creep, and that's a good combination. Despite it lacking a lot of elements that make it great, as talked about in the previous section, there are still elements of the Metroidvania genre that show up here. Some people are convinced it's completely not a Metroidvania, but I view the game as more of a Metroidvania light, something that has some elements of its genre, but not completely committing to those, and admittedly, it's to its detriment sometimes. During my time with the game, I enjoyed the Volt Forge and Ice Belt the most. They were my favorite areas to navigate, even if they do pull off the same trick. Exploring an area with the power off, then having to turn it back on and making your way back through it. With Prime 4's flawed design philosophy, Volt Forge and Ice Belt represent the best of what it can do. The other areas are pretty forgettable, unfortunately. It was either too basic of an area to remember anything from, or there were annoying elements to it that hindered my enjoyment of the area as a whole. Looking at you, Flarepool. The area with the most amount of wasted potential was the Great Mines. It had a mechanic where missile use would alert extra enemies and call in backup. I liked that, but it wasn't used to the fullest, and I honestly expected more creative puzzles with this limitation. I'm guessing they played around with it and found limiting your offensive options annoying, but that's just a guess. But Mokebone, you might ask. You have great criticism, and I'm going to like this video and subscribe to your channel anyways, but I thought you hated this game. Remember that whole first section about how Prime 1 was so much better and how the map layout was way better than Prime 4, and how segmented and broken and boring the level design in this game is? How do you even like the best of areas? It's simple. I do not like Prime 4 as much as Prime 1, and the design and philosophies of 1 are far superior. But that doesn't mean that Prime 4 is devoid of some basic redeeming value as a Metroid game that is different than Prime 1. Different does not mean bad. It does not mean good either. It also means that a game like Prime 4 might have a place in the franchise. Despite all that I said, I don't hate Prime 4 because it isn't Prime 1. But I am disappointed in it because if it wasn't going to be like Prime 1, it should at least do what it wanted to do well. And it only does that around half the time. When people have said that Prime 4 is too linear, my natural next question is, what is it too linear in comparison to? Prime 1? I agree, but Metroid has been linear before, and it worked out fine for those games. To me, the dynamic between Prime 1, a freer exploration-based experience, and Prime 4, a more linear, straightforward experience, is similar to the Metroid GBA games. Zero Mission gives you a lot more freedom. It even allows you to fight bosses out of order. On my first playthrough, I fought Ridley before I fought Kraid because I learned you can get a lot of places with bombs. And while you always follow a set order of bosses and power-ups in Prime 1, the similarity here is that you rarely know where you are going and you have to figure that out. Fusion is extremely straightforward with what you do and how you do it, with it even confining you to smaller areas at a time. Kind of like Prime 4. It even shows you your next objective for most of the game. Not a lot of people complain about Fusion being too linear, do they? It's because Fusion is successful in a lot of its mechanics and story, and its level design is a lot better. It ends up being just a different flavor of Metroid, kind of like how Prime 4 is at its best moments. And yeah, I prefer Zero Mission and Prime 1 over Fusion and Prime 4 any day of the week, but both Fusion and even Prime 4 are still worthwhile. Fusion is a much better experience than Prime 4 due to how well it lets you struggle to figure out where to go within the designated areas. That still kept it compelling to me, and maybe Prime 1 isn't the only game Prime 4 should have taken notes from. Before we move on to our next topic, I quickly wanted to give a shout out to the bosses in this game. They stand out in stark contrast to the regular enemies and represent the best combat of what Prime 4 has to offer. This might be a bit controversial, but there wasn't a single one I didn't like. Almost all of them revolved around a newer mechanic that allowed you to free aim while locking onto an enemy. I found this mechanic engaging and refreshing, which the game really needed. Where the regular enemies lacked creativity, the bosses are full of them. There's even a little defeat fake out with the Great Mines boss that caught me off guard, and I totally took the bait. It's these moments that the game needed more of, and I would have liked to see some of the puzzles that the bosses throw at you implemented into the game as a whole. Except Varmus. I kind of forgot about him when I wrote this video. The only good thing about this boss is the way you defeat him. Good riddance. Okay, let's talk about the optional items in the game. Something that I've seen a little bit around Reddit were criticisms of the puzzles and complexity of what you have to do to get these. I actually agreed with this on my first run through. It felt like almost every missile expansion or shot expansion is just one beam shot or quick scan away from a power-up being revealed. Not much of a puzzle in that, and it felt like there were too many free gimmies. A free energy tank here, a missile expansion laying out in the open there. Those are important to have since some players will never get those optional items and just beeline the main quest. There needs to be a base level of a power creep. It just felt like I got a lot more items than I should have in a way that wasn't engaging. But finishing the game made me realize that I actually missed a lot more items than I thought I did, and there was a lot more hidden in those linear levels than it first appears. So I went back through and got 100% items, and let me tell you, there's some good puzzles in here. My personal favorite requires a Prime 1 style bomb jump to complete. I appreciated that little throwback. The only issue I had with these is that most of them relied on a late game power up that you get, which means that it's just optimal to sweep through every area right after you beat the game. This has always been true, but one thing that I was hoping for Prime 4 to innovate on was a smarter placement of puzzles and power-ups so all the best content isn't being pushed to post-game. It's a small complaint though, considering that if you are going for 100%, you're gonna have to experience them at some point anyways. By the way, I highly recommend anyone going for 100% item completion in this game. They have a great system in that if you find scout bots and shoot them with the electric shot, you can scan them and they reveal all items in the current area. It made it very easy to 100% for a game that makes traveling from one area to the next a complete chore. I also like that it's now more about the puzzles to get to those power-ups than it is for finding them altogether, since the game doesn't prioritize exploration anyway. I still like the system in Dread way better, where you can see just a general area of where they are and not the exact location, but this is a much better alternative than wandering around the desert, lost and confused, and hoping that you stumble across something important. One last compliment I wanted to sprinkle in: the music and visuals. Holy smokes, this game looks and sounds gorgeous. I think it's one of the best looking games on the Switch too, but that doesn't matter as much as the game's art direction. It's one of the only ways in which Prime 4 is on par with its predecessors. Every area is super distinct, and the atmosphere that each one creates around it is so compelling. My favorite area visually is the ice belt. I literally took a screenshot of the ice belt intro because of how beautiful it looked. You can see it right here in my footage. Volt Forge is a close second, and now that I think about it, this strength in art direction is probably the reason why I like these areas so much. They have an atmosphere to match their solid gameplay. These strengths in art direction is about what I expected from the game, but it still blew me away at times. Okay, let's finally talk about the most common false criticism in this game. It's that Prime 4 lacks innovation in any meaningful way, which makes it outdated in the current gaming landscape. After all, the power-ups are pretty much the same from Prime 1, with some even missing, and there's really nothing new that Prime 4 has to offer besides a motorcycle and a big desert, which already don't do the game any favors. I don't blame people for having this criticism. In fact, I think that the first part of that statement is true. I replayed Dread on hard mode for this video, and something that stuck out to me is how much Dread takes Metroid in a completely new direction. The boss design is much more complex, and there are plenty of new mechanics that provide Dread with a lot more depth and interactivity. There's the all-powerful parry that you'll need to learn in order to succeed, as well as the more streamlined linearity that makes you feel like you're exploring the map without the overt go here, do this that Fusion kind of struggles with. But the best part is the dash that changes how you fight and explore. It adds a level of mobility to Samus where her only option before was shine sparking, which is very situational. Overall, I can't say enough good things about Dread. It was a pleasure replaying that game. It's great. Now, a more interesting conversation opens up with the second half of this complaint. The whole Prime is outdated in the current gaming landscape, because there's a couple valid questions here. What is Metroid Prime's role in a genre that has become so action-oriented? Is it falling behind recent innovations in the genre? Does a game without a parry mechanic or a flashy movement option have a place in the genre that it helped breathe life into? Look, at the core of this complaint is an assumption that for a game to be worthwhile, it must offer something completely new that nothing before has offered. But I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with making a sequel that doesn't revolutionize the series or genre. It could still be a good game, maybe just not a great one. How I feel about Prime 4 is kind of like how I've grown to feel about God of War Ragnarok. This is a sequel to a game that I loved with all my heart, but there were a lot of things about Ragnarok that I found to be a little disappointing. It doesn't innovate on anything and makes some serious missteps in the writing, which makes me like it way less than the original, but I still had fun playing despite some serious issues. Why? Because I thought it was still fun to do God of War things. I found the base gameplay fun, I still cared about the characters, and I liked the world that they made and expanded upon. I think the industry has gotten a bit too obsessed with the idea of innovation, maybe because we all play more games than ever before, and we've mastered so much of what is put in front of us. It leads me to believe that maybe the issue isn't the games themselves, but market saturation. I'm not really sure on that one. I'm just a guy trying to enjoy his video games. But even if you put aside the ideas that I just laid forward, what do you expect a Prime game to do while keeping the essence of a Prime game intact? Let's say that Retro made another Prime game exactly like Prime 1, but just randomized the power-ups and in a new order, with newer looking areas and a slightly tweaked story. The level design is fixed and there's not a green crystal in sight. Would this complaint about lacking innovation be as popular? I don't think so. Prime 4 doesn't have the jump that Dread made. There's no denying that. And I don't want to keep throwing Fusion under the bus, but Fusion didn't really have any abilities that affected gameplay like that either, and I still think it is a very worthwhile entry in the series. The only jump it actually made was making things more linear. Every power-up from Fusion was there before except the wide beam and the diffusion missile. And while it is frustrating that there isn't many new power-ups in Prime 4, because there really should have been, anything I can think of from Dread specifically would hold back the Prime series from being Prime. Crazy movement, more in-depth shooting mechanics, stealth sections. Even if you moved in a different direction and made a big giant open world, there's a serious danger of these things undercutting what makes Metroid Prime special. A slower paced shooter that relies on atmosphere and exploration and puzzles over combat skill. Let's put this another way. 100 times out of 100, I will take Prime 4 failing to be what I wanted out of a Prime game because it didn't do enough to be a good Prime game over the radical alternative. That Prime 4 became something else entirely because it focused on becoming like every other Metroidvania. I am not convinced that the new advancements in the genre would reflect well here because of how much this genre has morphed into being action-oriented. Let's ask a question to nail my point home. What's the better game, Cyberpunk 2077 or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2? Both are RPGs with many systems that allow you to act out your fantasy in whatever time period that it takes place in. They both feature live-action combat, complex quests, NPCs that you can romance, and a compelling main quest, but they have stark differences in design philosophies. For those that know both games well, hopefully you've caught on immediately that this is a trick question. For those that are unaware though, Cyberpunk 2077 is an RPG that is a bit lighter on the RPG elements. It has a lot of systems that interact in a way that allows you to grow your character how you want it to, but it also has streamlined quest design, a lot of flexibility in how you interact with systems that you aren't currently specializing in, and a lack of any hardcore RPG elements. In contrast, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is such an RPG that it drives people away. I'm a few hours into the game and I'm already overwhelmed with the systems that are in place. You have to sleep so you don't get tired, you have to eat so you don't get famished, you start off with nothing and you have to build your way back up, and sometimes it's very monotonous to do so. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is, without a doubt, more of an RPG than Cyberpunk is. Does Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 have more depth than Cyberpunk? Yeah, I think it's undeniable that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is an evolution in the genre. Is it a more rewarding experience? In some ways, yes, but Cyberpunk is still a fun game to play, and a good game, despite it not having all the depth that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 has. It also has way better combat. I can imagine what it would be like though if every game recently was like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and then the Cyberpunk rolls along and suddenly everyone is losing their minds, saying that it's a bad game because of its simpler systems. Cyberpunk's simplicity is a strength that it leverages. I know it's a bit of an unfair comparison because both Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Cyberpunk are incredible, and Prime 4 is just okay or even good with a heavy dose of flaws. The reason I chose Cyberpunk and not something like Starfield that has some similar issues and potentially the same quality status as Prime 4 is because I'm trying to refute the principle behind asking Prime 4 to be something it isn't. I think it's very obvious that Cyberpunk and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 aren't trying to be the same kind of game. And any criticism of Cyberpunk that says that it isn't as immersive as an experience because it lacks systems that it actively tries to avoid should be dismissed without a second thought. And that's what's relevant. The million-dollar question is if Prime 4 could have been a successful game without evolving into something that is a far cry from what Metroid Prime has always been. And I think it could have. When I said that Prime 4 is exactly the sum of its parts, I meant it. That sum is a game that inconsistently delivered on the promises of what makes it a Prime game, and is marred by an overall dumb map layout that doesn't reward backtracking, and instead punishes it. All the complaints about combat being outdated, or power-ups not adding movement options, or it being too linear is comparing Prime 4 to a franchise or game that it is not trying to be. You can prefer the depth or exploration of other games. That's perfectly fine. In some ways, I do too. Those experiences make for a more compelling game mechanically. But I still love the simple feeling of entering an unknown world where I feel isolated, exploring and learning about what happened to the beings that were once here, and setting out to see new sights and areas that are alien to even a bounty hunter like Samus Aran. I enjoy grabbing power-ups to unlock new abilities simply to get to new places, and I enjoy roaming around and scanning and exploring. Much like Cyberpunk, simplicity could have been Prime 4's biggest strength. Instead, it's a weakness, because there are other areas and features and design decisions that makes Prime 4 a weaker Metroid Prime game, and an even weaker Metroidvania game. It's these reasons that Metroid Prime 4 falls short of the highs of the other games, not because the Prime formula and design is inherently outdated. Don't punish the Prime franchise because it doesn't have the boss fights, or the combat, or the movement, or the crazy customization options that other Metroidvania games have evolved into, and that includes Dread. Nobody should want crazy movement and hard boss fights and deep combat mechanics out of a Prime game that would fundamentally change its focus from puzzles and atmosphere and storytelling to combat. That's not Prime, that's regular Metroid now, or Hollow Knight, or Prince of Persia. I really hope that if there is never another Prime game, that somebody else makes something like it. Because I think something as simple that has the strengths that Metroid Prime 1 does all these years later has a place as a certain type of Metroidvania. Even Prime 4 has strengths that deserve to be leveraged. Those strengths from this franchise are not outdated. Instead, it just might be what the genre needs right now when the landscape is so focused on action combat. It's just a shame that Prime 4 failed in too many ways to be that game the genre needed. Thank you for watching.